December 23, 1940. Winston Churchill sat alone in his study at 10 Downing Street, staring at a single sheet of paper. It was a financial report from the Treasury. Britain's gold reserves, the entirety of the empire's wealth accumulated over centuries, would be completely exhausted in exactly 14 days. On January 6, 1941, Britain would be bankrupt. The Royal Navy would have no fuel. The Royal Air Force would have no ammunition. The British Army would have no food. And America, the only nation capable of saving them, demanded payment in gold for every rifle, every ship, every gallon of fuel. Churchill picked up his pen and began writing the most desperate letter any British Prime Minister had ever sent to an American president. The first line was brutally honest. The moment approaches when we shall no longer be able to pay cash for shipping and other supplies. He was telling Franklin Roosevelt that Britain was broke. Completely, utterly, irreversibly broke. And if America didn't change the rules immediately, Nazi Germany would win the war by spring simply because Britain couldn't afford to keep fighting. This is the story of how the world's largest empire went bankrupt in 18 months. How America's neutrality laws nearly handed Hitler total victory, and how Churchill's confession of financial catastrophe forced Roosevelt to create the program that saved democracy itself, Lend-Lease. But first, we need to understand how Britain, the nation that controlled 1/4 of Earth's surface and ruled 450 million people, ran out of money while fighting for its survival. September 3, 1939. Britain declared war on Germany with confidence. The Treasury held £450 million in gold reserves. That's roughly $20 billion in today's money. His Majesty's government calculated this would fund the war for 3 years minimum. They were catastrophically wrong. The problem was simple mathematics that nobody in London wanted to believe. Britain could not feed itself. Britain could not arm itself. Britain could not fuel itself. The island imported 70% of its food, 100% of its petroleum, and nearly all raw materials for weapons production. Everything came by ship from across the Atlantic, and America, still officially neutral, demanded immediate payment in gold for every single cargo. No credit, no loans, no delayed payment. The Neutrality Acts, passed by the United States Congress in 1935 and 1937, made it illegal for America to sell weapons to any nation at war unless they paid cash and transported the goods themselves. It was called cash and carry. Roosevelt hated the policy. He believed it would strangle Britain and France while helping Germany, which could produce its own weapons domestically. But Congress, terrified of being dragged into another European war, refused to change the law, so Britain paid, and paid, and paid. September 1939. Through May 1940, Britain purchased $1 billion in American aircraft, ammunition, and raw materials. Paid in gold bullion shipped from London to New York on Royal Navy cruisers. The ships sailed in secret, carrying Britain's national wealth across U-boat-infested waters. Each shipment reduced the reserves. Each month brought the bankruptcy date closer. Then France fell. June 22, 1940. France surrendered after just 6 weeks of fighting. Britain now stood completely alone. The entire European continent from Norway to Spain was controlled by Nazi Germany or its allies. The Royal Air Force faced the Luftwaffe in the Battle of Britain with aircraft whose ammunition was purchased with gold shipped to America weekly. Churchill's Minister of Supply, Andrew Duncan, presented the devastating calculations in July 1940. At current consumption rates, fighting Germany alone while importing everything needed to survive, Britain's gold reserves would last until March 1941. 8 months. After that, Britain would have no ability to purchase food, fuel, or ammunition from its only possible supplier. The United States would be forced to watch Britain starve and surrender, not from military defeat, but from bankruptcy. Churchill immediately began a desperate lobbying campaign aimed at one man, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the American president, was sympathetic. Roosevelt understood that if Britain fell, Nazi Germany would control Europe's industrial capacity, its resources, and its strategic position. America would face a hostile Atlantic dominated by the German Navy and a hostile Pacific dominated by Japan. The global balance of power would shift catastrophically against the United States. But Roosevelt faced a massive political obstacle. The American public was overwhelmingly isolationist. 68% opposed any involvement in the European War. The Neutrality Acts reflected genuine popular sentiment. Congress would never approve loans or military aid to Britain. Any attempt would destroy Roosevelt's presidency and guarantee a Republican victory in the 1940 election. So Roosevelt waited. He encouraged Churchill privately, but could not act publicly. And Britain's gold kept flowing to America while the deadline approached. October 1940. The Treasury reported £200 million remaining. 4 months of war. November, 150 million, 3 months. December, 100 million, 2 months. British economists calculated the exact date of national bankruptcy. January 6, 1941. On that day, Britain would lack funds to purchase the food shipments scheduled for January. Rationing, already severe, would become starvation. Troop ships returning from Africa and Asia would have no fuel for the return voyage. Aircraft production would halt because raw aluminum was purchased from America with gold that would no longer exist. This wasn't a dramatic military crisis. It was a quiet administrative catastrophe. Britain wouldn't be invaded. It would simply run out of money and slowly collapse. Churchill knew that Roosevelt's hands were tied by Congress and public opinion. But he also knew that Roosevelt had won re-election on November 5th with a massive mandate. The political calendar provided a narrow window. If Churchill acted immediately after Roosevelt's re-election, but before the new Congress was seated in January, there might be time to change American policy. So on December 8, 1940, Churchill wrote the letter. 4,000 words, 15 pages, single-spaced, typed personally by Churchill's secretary with multiple handwritten corrections by the Prime Minister. It was addressed to President Roosevelt at the White House and marked personal and secret. The letter arrived in Washington on December 9th while Roosevelt was vacationing in the Caribbean aboard the USS Tuscaloosa. An aide delivered it by seaplane. Roosevelt read it twice, then spent 2 days thinking alone on the ship's deck. Churchill's letter was a masterpiece of persuasion disguised as a financial confession. He opened with brutal honesty. Britain was going broke. The moment approaches when we shall no longer be able to pay cash for shipping and other supplies. Then he pivoted to America's self-interest. If Britain fell, Roosevelt would face a United States of Europe under Nazi domination, armed with the combined industrial might of Germany, France, Belgium, Netherlands, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and Scandinavia. The Battle of the Atlantic would become the Battle of the American coast. Then Churchill made his request. Not a loan, not charity. A new system where America would build weapons, ships, and aircraft, then lend them to Britain with payment deferred until after the war ended. America would become, in Churchill's phrase, the great arsenal of democracy. Roosevelt loved it. The idea solved every political problem simultaneously. America wouldn't be giving money to Britain, just lending equipment temporarily. Isolationists couldn't claim America was funding foreign wars because technically Britain would repay eventually, and American factories would roar back to life, ending the Depression while preparing for possible future conflict. Roosevelt returned to Washington and immediately began drafting the legislation that would become the Lend-Lease Act. He announced the concept at a press conference on December 17th using a simple analogy. Suppose my neighbor's home catches fire and I have a length of garden hose 400 or 500 feet away. If he can take my garden hose and connect it up with his hydrant, I may help him to put out his fire. Now, what do? I don't say to him before that operation, "Neighbor, my garden hose cost me $15. You have to pay me $15 for it." I don't want $15. I want my garden hose back after the fire is over. The American public understood immediately. Lend-Lease wasn't a gift. It was enlightened self-interest. Help Britain fight Germany now, or fight Germany alone later. Congress debated for 2 months. Isolationists like Senator Robert Taft fought desperately. Lending war equipment is like lending chewing gum, Taft argued. You don't want it back. But Roosevelt had the votes. On March 11, 1941, Congress passed the Lend-Lease Act by wide margins. Roosevelt signed it the same day. Britain would receive $7 billion immediately. No gold required, no bankruptcy, no surrender. Churchill later wrote that he went to bed that night and slept the sleep of the saved and thankful. The final irony? Britain's last gold shipment to America arrived in New York Harbor on January 4, 1941, 2 days before the calculated bankruptcy date. The ship carried the final 40 million pounds of Britain's reserves. If Lend-Lease had been delayed 2 more weeks, Britain would have been unable to purchase food imports scheduled for mid-January. Mass starvation would have begun in February. Churchill's desperate confession had worked. By admitting Britain was broke, he triggered American self-interest. By framing the crisis as a loan rather than a gift, Roosevelt outmaneuvered the isolationists. And by January 1941, the United States had effectively entered World War II economically, 18 months before Pearl Harbor forced military entry. Total Lend-Lease aid to Britain by war's end would reach $31 billion. Britain would spend the next 61 years repaying the debt, making the final payment on December 31, 2006. But in December 1940, when Churchill confessed Britain's bankruptcy, none of that mattered. What mattered was 14 days. 14 days between national collapse and salvation. 14 days that Winston Churchill turned into 6 more years of war, ultimate victory, and the survival of democracy itself.